Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being here. We'll get started in 30 seconds here. Feel free to turn your
recording in progress
or leave it off. Thanks, everyone, for being here this evening. My name's Tamsin Mills, and I'm a director with Pinna Sustainability, and I'll be facilitating this evening's webinar. Just having a few other people jump in, which is great. Nice to see you all this evening. Next slide, please, Victoria. So thanks again for being here. I want to start the meeting in a good way by acknowledging that we acknowledge and respect the Indigenous peoples whose traditional lands we are meeting on and joining from today. And in this webinar, we'll be providing an overview of work underway to modernize the Regional District of Central Kootenay's approach to managing land use in hazardous areas. The project team will be sharing information on two related projects which are helping to achieve this. The first, the Floodplain Management Bylaw project, which is a collaboration between the RDCK and the Village of Salmo, and the second, the Risk Tolerance Policy project. If we can go to the next slide, please, Victoria. I'd like to start this evening by introducing the project team who will be providing an introduction to these projects and answering your questions as well this evening. So starting with the team from the Regional District of Central Kootenay, this evening we have Stephanie Johnson, planner and co-lead for the Floodplain Management Bylaw project, and Nora Hannon, the senior advisor and project lead for the Risk Tolerance Policy project. From the BGC engineering team, which are the consultants supporting RDCK with this work, we have Chris Holm, principal geoscientist and risk lead, Alyssa Scordo, principal hydrologist and flood lead, and Victoria Camp, geological engineer leading the Risk Tolerance Policy project. Next slide, please, Victoria. So before we jump into the content this evening, I'd like to provide a quick overview of what we'll be covering. So we'll start with a presentation section of the webinar, and then we'll move to a question and answer session. So Chris will be starting by providing us some background and context on what geohazards are and how land use planning helps to manage their potential impacts. We'll then pass it to Alyssa, who will provide an introduction to the Floodplain Management Bylaw project, why an update is needed, and what this process to date has involved. Victoria will then introduce the Risk Tolerance Policy project, focused on supporting clearer, more consistent decisions around development in hazard-prone areas. There will be a dedicated question and answer period following the presentations, where the team will answer your questions. You can submit your questions at any time using the chat function. If you put your cursor on the bottom of the window right in the middle, you should see chat. And by opening that, it will pop up on the lower right of your screen, and you can type in there your questions. You can submit them at any time during the presentation. We won't be enabling audio for attendees during the session, but I'll be monitoring the questions as they come in, and we'll be forwarding these to the team during the question and answer session. So following the question and answer session, we'll finish the evening with next steps before we leave you to enjoy the rest of your evening. We really appreciate the interest and that you're here this evening. So I will pass it to Chris to get us started. Thanks, Chris.
Sounds good. Thank you, Tamsin. My name is Chris Holm. I'm a principal at BGC Engineering. I'm a geologist by training, and I've been involved with earlier earth science work, hazard mapping work since 2017. That's led up to some of the updates to the Floodplain Management Bylaw and the Risk Tolerance Policy that we will be talking about today. I'm going to introduce the projects and the work that we are doing before passing it over to Alyssa to provide more details on both of these two pieces, the Management Bylaw and the Risk Tolerance Policy. Just go to the next slide there, Victoria. So to start things off, the Regional District of Central Kootenay, like all mountainous regions in British Columbia and around the world, is subject to geohazards. And geohazards are a kind of natural hazard that we refer to. Generally speaking, they're natural processes that occur with different kinds of ground conditions and usually involve a mixture of water, rocks, and steeper terrain. We are including in the term geohazards tonight floods, which typically occur on the larger watercourses throughout the district, steep creeks, which are the steeper tributary creeks that typically have higher energy and carry higher volumes of debris and sediment. We usually break these into debris floods, which are water laden with debris, and debris flows, which are typically more destructive and resemble a consistency a little bit closer to wet concrete. And landslides. And landslides, there's lots of kinds of landslides, rockfall and earth landslides and other kinds of landslides. We're not talking about those so much today. Next slide. In the context of this region, we've been undertaking work to map different kinds of floods and steep creeks across the district for over a decade now. This work follows damaging hazard events throughout the district, notably the 2012 Johnson's Landing landslide, and then many on this call may recall, if you've lived in the region for a long time, the damaging floods in 2018, for example, or in 2020. Some of the mapping actually that is involved in this project supported some of the response work during those more recent emergencies. In the context of that, and founded on hazard information, land use planning and regulation helps manage risk to people and assets in these hazard-prone areas. And that's the topic of today. So take a look at the next slide there, Victoria. So when we think about decisions, and we think about the decision-making process, we're thinking about the maps, and we're thinking about the bylaws, and we're also asking an important question, which is, all areas have risk. Most of life has risk. What's the level of risk that we might be prepared to tolerate in the areas in which we live? So we're undertaking two projects supporting the district in these two distinct areas. The first that we're going to be talking about today relates to the floodplain management bylaw, which is the bylaw that supports decision-making around the development of land in flood and steep creek-prone areas. The second is a policy document that's aiming to support a key question, which is, what does safe mean when geoscientists and engineers, qualified professionals, support these development applications? Next slide. In the spirit of that work, we've been going through a number of different steps. And maybe Victoria, just start opening up a few of these here and I'll talk through them quite quickly. We took a look at different areas of practice. There's many different approaches to floodplain management bylaws across the province and elsewhere around the world. We took a look at those best practices to see what might make sense to update for this particular district. And we submitted that in May, just this year. We've also engaged with a number of parties that will be involved with floodplain management bylaws in a variety of levels, from those that are going to be involved from a governance perspective to staff that are going to be tasked with enacting these bylaws, provincial ministries, qualified professionals as well that will be directly involved in the process, and today with our engagement with yourselves, the public. Next slide. Oh, there we go. We also compiled the data that's associated with regulatory mapping. And by data, I mean maps, the flood maps and the alluvial fans that support the policy work. And lastly, the team has been updating the bylaw and drafting policy language itself. This work is intended to modernize the bylaws to reflect the latest information and findings. And we'll be talking about that in a little further detail later in this presentation. We're going to be submitting the final report really soon, this May. And after that, the district will be transitioning to implementation. It's important to note that none of what we will be talking about today has yet been approved by council. This is all still in the discussion stage. So how do these types of projects impact you as residents that might be living on a floodplain or in an alluvial fan? If you're located on a floodplain, the floodplain management bylaw provides building requirements, minimum elevations, and setbacks. A site-specific floodplain exemption is required to deviate from the bylaw anywhere in the floodplain. In some cases, a qualified professional might be retained to conduct necessary work. Required actions include completing a site assessment to assess a site as quote-unquote safe for the use intended. The qualified professional report is submitted with the application, and as long as it meets the professional practice requirements and RDCK's requirements, following review by RDCK's staff, the development proposal may be approved, and that requires RDCK board approval prior to proceeding. I'm going to pass it to Alyssa now to get into a little bit more detail about the floodplain management bylaw. Alyssa?
Great. Yes, thanks, Chris. Thanks for that context. And with that, I'd like to provide a bit of an update of the work that we're doing to provide direction for the floodplain management bylaw for RDCK and Salmo. In the next few slides, I'll cover what the current bylaws do, why they're being updated, and what could potentially change with the update. I'd like to leave with one takeaway message, in that it's the floodplain management bylaw is really a key regulatory tool used by the regional district and the village of Salmo to manage flood and steep creek hazards, which Chris had given us a general overview in terms of those hazards in the district. The bylaw in particular applies to all electoral areas across the district, including areas that don't have zoning. So for many properties in the region, the bylaw is a regulatory tool applied to manage development in hazard areas. Next slide. At a very high level, the floodplain management bylaw provides the foundation for how flood and steep creek hazards are considered in official community plans and broader land use policy. More specifically, they guide day-to-day development decisions, as Chris had mentioned, for example, when a qualified professional assessment is required, where buildings can and cannot be located, and what minimum elevations or floodplain setbacks might be needed to be established. This approach really aligns with the province's recent BC flood strategy, which emphasizes using land use planning as a key tool for managing risks associated with flood hazards. By integrating flood hazard information directly into planning and development decisions, these bylaws can help reduce risk by keeping people and development out of areas that are most hazardous. Overall, they are important tools for supporting long-term community resiliency. Next slide. The project is focused on updating floodplain management bylaws for both RDCK and the village of Salmo to reflect new hazard mapping that has been completed since 2019 and current best practices in terms of flood and steep creek risk management. As Chris had mentioned, one of the first steps that was undertaken in this work was to understand what other jurisdictions are doing to manage flood risk. RDCK's current bylaw was last updated in 2019, and Salmo's dates back to 1994. So there's been significant evolution in both the technical information that's available through all of the hazard mapping that has been undertaken across the district, and how flood risk is managed across BC. On this map, you can see RDCK's 11 electoral areas along with member municipalities. The bylaw, as mentioned, applies to those rural electoral areas, while Salmo's applies within the village. Through this project, we're developing draft bylaw language that aligns across both jurisdictions where appropriate, while still reflecting their different planning context. Next slide. In general, RDCK and Salmo's current bylaws closely align in their approach to regulating development for flood-prone areas. Both of the bylaws manage flood and steep creek hazards through sort of three main tools. One, as we've mentioned, is hazard maps that delineate where the hazards are. flood construction levels that set minimum elevations for new buildings and developments, and floodplain setbacks that establish how far back from a watercourse development needs to be to ensure that the development avoids areas prone to geohazards. Next slide here. So what's actually changing with this bylaw? And by I say actually changing is potentially changing as we work through the later stages of the project. We've grouped the updates into three main areas we'll walk through in the next few slides. First is related to hazard terminology, essentially the words and definitions that are used to describe different types of hazards. Second is regulatory mapping, which includes maps and schedules that show where the bylaw applies and associated flood construction levels and setback requirements. The third is the policy language, the rules themselves, including how they're applied, as well as things like exemptions and site-specific considerations. The image shown here is from RDCK's public web map, which is the main tool that property owners can use to understand where hazards may apply to their property. And as part of the work that we're doing, we're providing regulatory mapping that could be used to update RDCK's public web map. Slide. Through an engagement that we've been undertaking for both of these projects, we heard that some of the terminology in RDCK's current bylaw could be clarified. So one example is the use of the term non-standard flood and erosion areas, or NSFEAs, which groups together a wide range of different hazards without clearly distinguishing what type of risk is actually presented. So one of the proposed updates is to replace terms like NSFEA and alluvial fan with clear hazard-specific terminology. For example, floodplains to refer to riverine and lakeshore flooding, steep creek hazard areas for debris flow and debris flood areas, and bank erosion and avulsion hazard areas where channels may shift over time. While this may seem like a small change, it can make meaningful difference in how the bylaw is interpreted and applied. And we're hoping that clearer terminology helps property owners, applicants, and qualified professionals make better understanding of the hazards that are present and what that means to development. As mentioned, the second area of change is related to regulatory mapping, specifically updating flood construction levels and setbacks to reflect the most recent hazard studies. Since 2019, RDCK has coordinated on a large-scale project to complete flood and steep creek mapping across the district. This includes detailed studies for multiple floodplains and alluvial fans. As well, there's been additional work that's been completed by member municipalities. All of the updated information will be incorporated into bylaw schedules and the public web map, which I showed on the previous slide. On this slide, you can see a comparison between older flood construction levels, which would be the historical FCLs that were created in 1990, and updated with more recent studies. Where detailed floodplain mapping exists, we would be providing updates to carry forward into the bylaw. And for areas where there isn't detailed studies yet available, we provide consistent recommendations to help guide development. Next slide. The third area of change is policy language itself. Through engagement, we heard that parts of the current language could be clearer, particularly around things like exemptions to where the bylaw applies and the types of structures that are exempt. The proposed updates would focus on clarifying and tightening the language so that applicants, staff, and qualified professionals are working from the same understanding. So just in general, in terms of next steps for this project, RDCK and Salmo will work to evaluate the recommended language from BGC and PINA and bridge this project into implementation with additional consideration from staff. At the end of the day, we hope to use this information to help guide better development decisions so we can help keep buildings out of high hazard areas and support safer, more resilient communities. Next, I'd like to turn it to Victoria Camp to provide a little bit of a project update on the risk tolerance project.
Awesome. Thanks, Alyssa. So to dive right in, following on from what Chris and Alyssa have shared, as we know, natural hazards or geohazards pose risks to life and property. And as we can see on the slide, the Johnson's Landing slide from 2012 is a prime example of the type of scenario that poses risk and that the RDCK wants to prevent in the future through land use planning. So currently, the RDCK manages risks related to geohazards through tools such as floodplain management bylaw that you just heard about, Section 56 of the Community Charter, both which in some form may require a report from a qualified professional certifying that the land is safe for the use intended, as we've heard. The intent of this project, the Risk Tolerance Policy Project, is to help develop such a policy that can be used as a tool to help manage geohazard risk in the regional district. A risk tolerance policy and the criteria set out therein can provide a consistent basis of the level of acceptable or tolerable risk in a community or jurisdiction and what is meant by safe for the use intended. You can see on the screen that there's other jurisdictions that have developed such policies. And a policy like this that defines safe helps the jurisdiction communicate what that means. It helps provide clarity for QPs in their reporting, staff in their evaluations, homeowners who are soliciting these types of reports, and just generally various parts, folks in the RDCK that are navigating this particular application process. So this project in particular is focused on helping the RDCK define that word safe in this context. So for development and building permit decisions in hazard areas where risk assessments have been required under regulation, hazard and risk assessments. And so these criteria will support risk reduction decision-making for both new and existing buildings, and can also potentially support risk evaluation for structural risk control measures or setting risk control targets. Apologies. Sorry. Carrying on. For future measures such as flood protection structures, steep creek debris, retention structures, or otherwise diversion structures. So you might be wondering, how will this policy work and how will it fit into the existing development approval system? Well, there's a few things to know. First, the risk tolerance criteria that would be developed and that BGC has been helping to develop over the course of the last several months would outline criteria for several different risk types. So individual risk, which, as you can see on the screen, considers only individual elements. And if there's more development in a particular hazard area, the individual risk level does not necessarily change with respect to the changing density on that hazard. But also the criteria can consider group risk. And so this is looking at the risk posed to everyone in the hazard area, and all else equal, more development in that hazard area does increase the group risk. So by understanding both of these, this can help decision makers understand the risk through many lenses. And and this just helps to kind of broaden the information on which decision makers are being informed. The policy that we have drafted and that is under consideration outlines additional requirements as well for the design and planning of the developments that are being applied to or applied for. And these additional requirements aim to reduce the risk of the development to as low as reasonably practicable. And this is a common framing in the literature and in kind of the practice of risk assessments in this space in terms of just reducing the risk to in as much as recently possible. Additionally, the requirements that have been drafted and are under consideration would be differentiated by development type. So requirements with respect to this policy would generally be increasing for newer and larger developments where the risk reduction potential is higher. So where there's potentially more opportunity for further risk reduction. And you'll note here that I've also stipulated on this slide that we're specifically talking about life loss risk in the development of these risk tolerance criteria and policy. And this is because presently the recommended risk tolerance policy that has been developed has only been prepared with respect to life safety or life loss risk. And we acknowledge that there are several different types of risk, economic risk for one, infrastructure risk that can be considered, but they have not been included here. However, it's notable to say that in many cases, the effort of reducing life loss risk also reduces risk types, other risk types, and vice versa. As for how a potential risk tolerance policy would fit into the current regulatory system, the policy recommended would not supersede the existing land use regulation process, but would instead enhance it. And it does this in several ways. So it wouldn't change the existing requirement within the approval process. As already stipulated, the regulatory framework exists to require QP assessments already in certain situations. So we would just kind of carry on and be aligned with that. Risk tolerance criteria additionally would provide a clearer, more consistent basis for the assessment of safe for the use intended in hazard-prone areas. So like I said, this helps qualified professionals, staff evaluating applications, and property owners alike. Additionally, adopting risk tolerance or risk-informed land use decision-making is in line with best practice, particularly where there is potential for life loss. And because this is best practice, there are many other municipalities and jurisdictions that have endeavored to develop a similar policy. So this challenge isn't of considering the adoption and development of this sort of policy isn't unique to the RDCK. So other municipalities and regional districts in the province and Western Canada have already developed these, so such as the Cowichan Valley Regional District, the District of North Vancouver, the town of Canmore, just to name a few. And from their experience and from their precedent in the developing and implementing these policies, we can learn a lot. And as Chris had mentioned, the comparative analysis that we completed endeavored to do just that in informing the recommendations that have been made as part of this project for consideration of the RDCK. So that's essentially the summary of the risk tolerance policy as we've currently kind of progressed the work. And to kind of summarize both projects to in terms of what they're endeavoring to do for the RDCK. As we noted, the RDCK is exposed to geohazards, and these hazards present risks. Current bylaws that exist in the RDCK regulate land use in hazardous areas and help manage this risk. The current regulatory framework can be improved, and these improvements would make it more complete, transparent, and effective. So these projects are aiming to improve these regulations, add to these regulations to support more clearer and consistent risk management for development, and just to be a little bit more specific on what the improvements are. To reiterate, these projects together aim to improve and enhance land use decision making in hazardous areas through updated mapping of geohazards in the region, particularly related to the floodplain management bylaw update, providing modernized policies aligned with the current best practices, clarifying expectations for land use applications, plannings and building permits related to new and existing properties, defining a set of criteria for qualified professionals to use to guide their work in assessing if the land is safe for the proposed work or safe for the use intended, and these will integrate and consider current and future conditions to enhance community resiliency. So with that, I'll hand it back to Tamsin to lead us through the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much to the team for that overview. We're now going to take some time to answer your questions. So thanks to those that put some in the chat so far. I'm going to bring a few forward. So we're looking at if a resident believes that the mapping is inaccurate, how can they be assured that the mapping is correct on their property?
I can try that. Take a first pass at that one. Thank you for the question. I think that's a really good question and something that we hear often. I think the work that we've been doing is been trying to compile all of the maps that are available best using the best available data in terms of technical studies, and so we have that information compiled at a regional scale, but just that mapping is intended to show where hazards are likely to be present, and as because of that, it might not capture every small stream in particular, and so we do include within the bylaw, and in the way the bylaw is currently written, it does include considerations for unmapped streams. So that would small watercourses that may not show up on regional scale maps, and so that language would be included in the bylaw to provide some direction in terms of flood construction levels and floodplain setbacks. In addition, like if required, site-specific situations that require a QP report would be able to properly delineate where those maps or where those water features are, and help to make sure that the mapping is correct as part of more on the ground applications. So really our intent here is to combine the best available data that we have at a regional scale and provide directions on what information can be provided for areas that have incomplete mapping.
Thanks, Alyssa. We have another question here. Given that there are some new hazard areas potentially coming forward in an amended bylaw, are the existing homes that are already built there grandfathered? Maybe I'll pass that to Stephanie, and Stephanie also ask you about heritage structures that physically can't meet new elevation or setback requirements.
Yeah, thank you, Tamsin, and thank you for the questions from our participants. Just to speak to the grandfathered question, which we're also calling lawfully non-conforming, if a particular structure, like a house, was built before the adoption of our new floodplain management bylaw that we're talking about here today, then that's okay. That would be fine for the existing structure. Where the proposed new bylaw would come into play would be for, say, for example, a future potential addition to that existing building, could be a house, and then that proposed addition would need to meet the new bylaw of the day, unless, depending on the size of that addition, fell under proposed exemption under that floodplain management bylaw. And the same would really go for heritage buildings as well. And just to speak about both of those questions, I'm talking in generalities overall, but if someone on the call or attending the webinar here today had a specific question related to their property, an existing development, the RDCK planning team would be happy to connect about that one-on-one after the webinar and to schedule a time that works just to talk about your property. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephanie. There is another question in that one. I'm going to paraphrase it. If a homeowner puts in a proper foundation and meets setback and flood construction level requirements in the bylaw, does that trigger compliance with the bylaw? I think I could answer that. If that's, I can jump in and just say that if the bylaw has pretty clear requirements for setbacks and elevations, and then some specific requirements in steep creek areas that would mean needing an assessment by a qualified professional. But if setbacks and elevations are met, that would be compliance with the bylaw. I'm going to give a few minutes for anyone else to just pop a question in the chat. We welcome questions through the chat. In the meantime, I'm going to ask, how would a resident check if their property is within an area regulated by the floodplain management bylaw? Maybe I'll pass that to Alyssa.
Yeah, one of the pieces that we mentioned, and maybe we could put that link in the chat as well, is the RDCK's public webpage that has access to all of the hazard information that has been compiled across the district. And so as part of the work that we're doing is updating that mapping and providing that to RDCK to provide to include on the public webpage. So that'd be one place to search. You can also look up particular addresses, and that would be a good starting point. And as Stephanie mentioned, if there's specific questions, that could be directed to RDCK.
Thanks, Alyssa. There's another question here. It's a bit tricky to paraphrase, but maybe I'll ask if how do residents go about performing protective or developing protective works on their property? Yeah, maybe I'll let the team read the question.
I can take that one, Tamsin, if it helps. There are, as the person asking the question states, there are some barriers, but they're from ministries, provincial ministries, and they're areas that are not regulated through RDCK bylaw. So in terms of doing mitigative works, that would come under provincial regulation. I'm not sure if Alyssa, you could add more to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good summary, Nora.
They're basically saying they're not liable, that you don't go through them. Well, it's to the ministries. Yeah.
Okay, we'll see if there are any other questions that come up. Maybe I'll ask this question in the meantime. Why does the RDCK need a geohazard risk tolerance policy, or what benefits does that policy provide?
Perhaps I can help with that question. Yeah, this is a common one, and the use of risk tolerance policy in British Columbia dates back over 20 years now, and it reflects the fact that while qualified professionals are tasked with determining levels of risk in accordance with local bylaws, under professional practice guidelines, it is not in fact the role of the qualified professional to determine what's safe enough. That's a question that's usually left to society to determine through governance. What that means in the absence of risk tolerance policy is that qualified professionals must come up with some kind of criteria to estimate a level of risk and then compare it against that criteria to determine what constitutes risk tolerance. Under current best practice, what we are asked to do is estimate levels of risk and then compare those to a level of risk tolerance using criteria where existing. So, for example, if the RDCK did not have risk tolerance criteria in place, but another jurisdiction in British Columbia does, such as the District of North Vancouver or Cowichan Valley Regional District or the District of Squamish, the QP would use that criteria as their measuring stick. What this means is that there can be inconsistency with how safe for the use intended is defined within a jurisdiction that doesn't have any risk tolerance criteria. And it's very helpful for jurisdictions that do have it because it can provide clarity to the decision maker and to the proponent about what standards they're going to be expected to meet in order to get their development approval.
Thanks, Chris. I'm seeing no more questions in the chat. Okay, we do have one. Do you have an updated list of QPs in the region that's public?
Oh.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that one. Thanks, Tamsin. The regional district doesn't endorse any one particular qualified professional. So when our planning or building team gets this type of question at the counter, we suggest that people check out the relevant association for engineers qualified in the field that would be able to do the work. And we often recommend searching on the association's website that you can look up the engineer by region as well, just for closeness to a particular property here in the Central Kootenays. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Stephanie. And I recognize in the chat that this resident had difficulty finding someone. So recognizing that's a challenge. Thank you to whomever posted the EGBC website in the chat. That's great, thanks. So that will take you to the opportunity to search for an engineer in the region.
Maybe just as a quick comment on that, that is a common challenge across the province, and QPs can be scarce in certain regions. When QPs contemplate taking on work, they're always looking for whether they can satisfy the appropriate standard of care according to their professional practice body. And that relates to the budget that they might have available to them, and it also relates to the amount of existing information that might support such work. Part of the project here relates to making sure that the existing information that's displayed on maps is accessible. And while that isn't a perfect solution, it can help find QPs because it means that QPs can be equipped with the best available information for particular areas.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, I'm going to make an awkward pause here while we wait for any other questions, and then we'll move to wrap up. Okay, we do have one. Okay, we understand there are 5 or 6 First Nations. Are we to consult and involve all? There has been some engagement with First Nations by the project team for this project, with all First Nations that share traditional territory overlapping with the RDCK. Does anyone on the project team want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I would just echo that as part of this work, we have been providing information about the project and also had opportunities to learn more about and provide some feedback as well as part of the work.
Yeah, but that is.
And then a question here about criteria for QPs.
Okay, so
Are there criteria for QPs to satisfy to be acceptable to the RDCK, such as previous work in the area? Perhaps this is a question for Stephanie or Nora. Is there a checklist or criteria, or if they're an engineer licensed through EGBC, are they acceptable to work in the area?
Thanks, Tamsin. Just to dovetail off of your comment, if they are licensed and have good standing with the Engineering Association and qualified under that to do the work, then we would look for any qualified professionals report to meet our terms of reference. If, for example, the qualified professional was doing work for a property owner, say for an application for a site-specific floodplain exemption, if a development proposal was showing that they were unable to meet the regulations in a floodplain management bylaw. So there's criteria that a professional engineer would follow in our terms of reference in order to provide us with a level of assurance. But nothing related to particular criteria that's acceptable, I guess, to the regional district in terms of where the qualified professional could be living and working. But as long as they're in good standing with the association and if they're working on a report that it meets our terms of reference requirements.
Thanks, Stephanie. And public observer, I think I misunderstood your previous question. If you're making an application under the floodplain bylaw, you would not need to involve the First Nations directly on your application. Oh, thanks. Alyssa put in the definition of a qualified professional. We have been using that term a lot and perhaps did not provide a good definition. So it's generally a professional engineer or professional geoscientist. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we all want to say thank you very much for taking the time out of your evening to join us for the webinar this evening. And as a reminder, and we can paste them back in here in the chat in case you joined after they were pasted in, there are Engage RDCK pages on both projects where you can find frequently asked questions with answers. And a recording of this webinar will be made available also on that same Engage RDCK website. So great place to go. I'm just going to go through some of the next steps for the project. I've covered many of these. We'd also really appreciate staying tuned for more communication on these projects. And if you have any property-specific questions or further questions, we'll put up the RDCK staff contact on the following slide, and we really welcome you to contact them directly to have those questions answered. So thanks again. Thanks, Stephanie. She's put the Engage RDCK web pages links in the chat. So thanks for joining us again, and we really wish you a great rest of your evening.
It's done, right? Well.